Okay, we're good to go. Welcome everyone. My name is Cassy Dorff. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and this is the OPSC, which is the Online Peace Science Colloquium. Today, let me also say I run the OPSC with two amazing people. One, Jennifer Barnes, who's a student at Vanderbilt University, and also Brad Smith, who is also an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. So we're happy to have you here, and we're happy to have our discussants and our presenters. Today, we will have a paper entitled Need to Eat to Live, the Interacting Effects of Food, Aid, and UN Peacekeeping on Civilian Victimization. This presentation has two presenters, and they're both here with us today. We have Bongjoo Kim, PhD student at SUNY New York Buffalo, and we also have Samaila Adelaiye, a recent PhD graduate from same institution. So we're really happy to have y'all here. And we have three awesome discussants who are taking time out of their busy weeks right before the weekend to join us. We have Meg Shannon from UC Boulder. Y'all could just wave. We have Martin Ottmann, University of Birmingham, joining us all the way across the pond. And we have Ore Koren from Indiana University in Bloomington. So thanks y'all for being here. I won't take up too much more time. I'll just also say that if we have anyone who joins in to watch, you can just put questions in the Q&A, and I will save those for the presenters, or I will facilitate them during the discussion so they get some airtime. The other last thing I'll quick say for the recording is that this will all be posted. It's on YouTube, it's on our Twitter. The Twitter is just OPSC Peace Science Society. And you can go to our website or Google us to find all of these recordings. We have lots of recordings. Assign them to your classes if you want. Tell your students how to practice good discussion and use us as your example, hopefully. Those are all available online. The OPSC was started back in 2015 to encourage these kinds of discussions. And so we keep them available for our broader peace science community. All right, I think, Bongjoo, are you starting off?
Yes.
Okay, yes. You can take it away when you're ready.
Should I just share the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, does everyone see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. Okay, then I'll start. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Bongjoo Peter Kim, a PhD student, and there's a co-author, Samaila Adelaiye, PhD, also from SUNY Buffalo, Department of Political Science. So I will go over the first part of the presentation where it most focuses more on theoretical perspective, and Sam will go over the empirical testing part. So the observable implication that we are focused on here is the global chronic hunger. So after 2001, the food price has been drastically increased, leaving almost like 700 million people with chronic hunger, Asia being the highest, and Africa is being the fastest rising. And of course, after COVID-19, it is expected that this number will be increased by 100 million to people more. Sadly, and also there's so many different kind of various problems that is caused by chronic hunger, including child malnutrition and adult obesity. But we're not focused on the chronic hunger itself, but instead we are focused more on the causal mechanism between this food insecurity that actually leads to civilian victimization and more conflict violence, and we're focusing on the question of why and how. Sadly, this is happening in the real world in the case of Haiti or Darfur, Sudan, or even in Syria, and even the Arab Spring is also, there's a lot of research that is saying that it was caused, one of the main cause was because of the food insecurity. So what is the world doing to counter this? So there's a big 4 agencies under UN. The first one is World Food Program, who is more focusing on the focusing on improving more aid to the global people, and whereas the World Bank is more focusing on to solve the problem more indirectly by providing more like better equipment for the people to make them help them to produce food more effectively. And FAO is doing the both, and IFAD is mainly focusing on the rural area to help the farmers out specifically. So me and Sam had a question of like, if are they doing this like more properly? So we wanted to look for how we can like test this and see whether they are doing a right job or not. So our main question in this research is, how do United Nations peacekeeping operations correspond to foreign aids that mitigates the food security issue and the civilian victimization? So in order to answer this question, I will go over the theoretical part. And before going into the UNPKO part, I want to mention that there is a unique dilemma that every aid agent is going through when they actually want to provide food aid to the conflict zone. So that is called like Samaritan's dilemma, a kind of moral hazard. So like after like going over the cases where like food aid agents actually provide food aid, government learn how they can lure them. So there's even a research on like them intentionally impoverishing people in order to lure more food aid from the food agents. And also for the insurgent groups, like it is more effective for them to like actually hijack the trucks that actually transporting the food aid to the civilians instead of like killing them for the food. So there's that kind of a dilemma. And there's a report that says like even up to like 80% of food aid is actually stolen by insurgent groups. So that's like really like yeah, sad situation. But even so, we thought that theoretically there is more positive expectations from more food aid in the conflict zone, which can actually lead to less civilian victimization and conflict violence in general. So because like even if that food aid actually leads to reaches rebel groups instead of civilians, that will generate like less grievance of both rebels and civilians, which will eventually lead to less civilian victimization. And also like in the long run, like every insurgent groups are facing these recruitment problems. So if we provide more food to the civilians, that would, for them, like it would be much less attractive for them to actually join the rebel groups. And in the long run, that will cause them to perish. And eventually we can expect a lesser civilian victimization and conflict in general. So now I will move on to the theoretical perspective of more UNPKO in the scene will lead to less civilian victimization and conflicts. So compared to where like a UNPKO is not at the presence of conflict zone, like if they're there, the calculation of cost and benefit for the rebels to commit a civilian victimization changes drastically, because since they're there, they have to we can expect like two different kind of effect. First, like signaling effect. So like UN just being in the conflict zone is signaling to the rebels like, if you want to kill people, you have to go through me. So like that is like a big barrier for them to like actually commit civilian victimization. So that we are expecting that will lead to less killing. And also like since most of the blue helmets consist of this troops, they can actually have this ability to actually protect them. So that can actually have cause this protecting effect, so that which will lead to less civilian victimization. And the second theoretical expectation from UNPKO is them acting as a mediator. So one of the most important factors that actually cause civil conflict to happen is information problems. So because since like both groups, rebels and civilians, they don't have that enough information for what each side wants, and since they have this animosity going through them, like it is really hard for them to even have a chance to communicate each other. So, and since the UN has this unique reputation, like we are expecting them to act as a mediator in the scene, so that they can bring those two representatives and on the table and reach an agreement instead of like meeting them in the conflict zone. And third expectation from them is UNPKO as acting as a provider. So even if like insurgents actually kill people to get more food, there's going to be a certain point where they have the state a more stable relationship where like civilians are providing more food, like a certain amount of food like regularly, and then the insurgent groups, instead of killing them, like even protect them. But the civilians are so vulnerable about against this external factors such as food price increase, government centralization, and even drought. So in that case, the food amount becomes decreased, and what can the insurgent groups do? They will kill more people. So we are expecting at that point, when the food aid is provided to this to actors, there would be less unnecessary killing, and it will make them go back to a peaceful relationship. So based on these three theoretical expectation, me and Sam came up with the hypothesis first: food aid mitigates the civilian victimization problem, and UNPKO and food aid have an interaction effect on mitigating civilian victimization. And I will pass my mic to Sam. Thank you. Yeah, since we are like using separate slides, he has to share. And then,
okay.
yeah, go again. Oh, sorry.
Looks like it's working. These look good. You'll just have to unmute, but we can see them well. Yeah, we can see them, but you have to unmute. There you go.
So basically for data, we kind of use our dependent variable is civilian violence. And this is pretty much a count of the number of attacks that target civilians during the conflict. So this is countries that already experiencing some form of civil violence, where the government is one of the actors. And then we count the number of times civilians have been attacked, and we get this from the ACLED data set. We also have independent variables, a PKO dummy, which is pretty much 1 or 0 for each year where peacekeepers were present. We have total food aid in tons, which we get from the World Food Programme's database, and we lag both variables for analysis as well. We have agricultural land in terms of percentage of land that is dedicated to agriculture, and that's gotten from the World Bank. A food price index gotten from the FAO, which is a yearly count of how expensive food is compared to the 2004-2006 average. And then we have GDP as a control, population, surface area, which is pretty much the size of the country's land mass, and conflict intensity, which is pretty much an indicator of whether the conflict has risen to a stage where up to 1,000 people have died in a particular year. So pretty much dividing whether it's like full blown out war or if it's just an armed conflict. And then our results kind of show some of the relationships we expect. Basically, countries that have more land for agriculture tend to be less likely to have civilian violence. But more importantly, for our area of concern, we find that food aid is linked to less of such violence. And so where a country is experiencing war, the higher the amount of food aid it receives, the less we are to see, the fewer the numbers of attacks that directly target civilians. And I must say that in this case, we're talking about attacks where non-state actors deliberately attack civilian populations. Our interactive term, however, don't show the support we were hoping for. There's no statistically significant relationship there. But as expected, more intense conflicts have more of such cases. Larger populations have more of such cases. Larger countries in terms of land mass have fewer. But when we use the lagged variables to find similar relationships, more food aid is linked to less of such violence, but the interaction with UN peacekeeping is not statistically significant. What this results kind of tell us that higher food insecurity was linked to fewer rebel attacks on civilians, which is pretty much in line with the general argument on the way food security increases victimization as researched by other scholars. But for some reason, we find that there is no new conditioning effect when there are UN peacekeepers in the fray. I must point out that in an earlier version of this paper where we used replication files, we found results for the interaction as well. But when we expanded and collapsed it, in this case to yearly data, we don't find any statistically significant relationship at all. However, from a theoretical standpoint, we see reason to believe that, well, if food insecurity is fueling attacks on civilians, then would expect that peacekeepers will in some way be an added advantage, in that relationship is broken for more effective dispersing of food aid. So this is something we plan to continue working on, seeing what about peacekeeping could make for more effective mitigation of civilian victimization fueled by food insecurity. Thank you. At this point, I want to also point out that I don't understand there's some part of the mix-up in the versions we sent in terms of updating the tables and things like that. And the results of the previous analysis are still there if you wanted to look at them, but the expanded time frame from 97 to 2019 gave us this results. And we look forward to a lively discussion on it.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation, and you can stop sharing your screen when you're ready. And I think we'll hear some comments first from Meg Shannon.
Thank you. And remind me, do I offer kind of all my comments or?
Yeah, so maybe start with big picture comments first, and we'll kind of try to get a discussion going around those, and then we can circle back to additional comments.
Great, sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much to the authors for this presentation. And there's a lot of terrible puns that I can come up with from this paper. Like, for instance, there's much food for thought that has emerged from this paper. And what I like about this is that you're taking the literature in an important direction, which is that we need to consider issues of food security and food aid in the process of civil war. And I'd say that's something that's been largely overlooked, and I think it's great that you're taking this on. I do have some big picture feedback, particularly in light of getting this paper ready to submit for publication. So the paper, in one sense, here's another pun, it bites off way more than it can chew. It comes at a number of questions, a number of different theories. There's a huge amount of literature that gets incorporated, and not all of it is relevant. So I'm going to encourage you to focus in this paper. And I see 3 avenues that were highlighted. One is, what is the relationship between food insecurity and violence? 2, what is the relationship between food aid and violence? 3, what is the effect of peacekeeping on the distribution of food aid on violence? As I see it, that first approach, food insecurity and violence, that's already been tackled, and you've cited some literature that does a nice job of this. So I might encourage you to steer away from that. And what that means is kind of reframing where you start the paper, when you start with a discussion of food insecurity. That's very meaningful, but I think you've got to focus on your message. So the second and third approach, which is the effect of food aid on violence, and then the interaction of UN peacekeeping on food aid and that effect on violence. I think that is where you need to go. So then the question is, well, why would we expect food aid in particular to affect violence? And I think this is where you have to have to do two things. You have to, first of all, tell us why food aid is different from other types of humanitarian aid, and be very clear about why we should focus on food aid in particular. And then the second approach, or the second tack that needs to be taken is, well, why does food aid affect violence? Your presentation did, I think, a better job than the paper of specifying one mechanism, which is that food aid potentially leads to fewer grievances by rebel groups and perhaps by civilians as well. And that ultimately results in less violence. But I guess what I need to know, or what I'd like to know as a reader, is, well, why should fewer grievances result in less violence? I can think of an alternative explanation where fewer grievances means, that the rebels are, have had a change in power, fewer grievances, they're more well-fed, they're more supported, they're therefore more likely to engage in violence. I can think of a number of routes. And so while I think the grievance story is perhaps a way to go, I think it's got to be sorted out in more detail. And I think most of the literature kind of approaches the use of violence as a bargaining process. And so I would encourage you to maybe take a look there and think about, how is food aid affecting the bargaining process, which is ultimately driving the use of violence against civilians. Ultimately the question is, the cost of violence is very high, and using violence against civilians is very costly. So why would food aid be so as important as to affect that and affect the calculations of actors to use violence against civilians? I think maybe looking at some cases would be really helpful, just getting a sense of what is actually happening. I honestly, as a Civil War, someone who studies Civil War, I don't really know what this looks like, the distribution of food aid and what that does on the ground. I just have very little picture surrounding that. So yeah, that is kind of where I would encourage the theory to go. And I think I'll end my bigger picture comments there, even though I've got some other things on the empirics too, but I imagine that will all come up. So thank you.
Thanks. Martin, did I see a two finger, or were you just moving your hand?
Me, yeah, yes. So there was not the two finger, but okay. I can give my comments now if
yeah, sure, go ahead. And if there's anything you feel reinforces what Meg said, just
my comments partly, I think, to some extent overlap with what Meg said. So but first of all, like Meg, thank you for the presentation. I think it's a really interesting paper with lots of potential, but unfortunately I don't have these nice puns, but I'll put it simpler. I think there still needs to be a bit of work done here and there. So first thing I want to say is, like what you mentioned, I like the general direction. I'm no expert on food security. I came at it rather from the angle of violence against civilians, where I have more expertise. But I think the incorporation of food aid or food security and more generally questions of agricultural resources in conflict zones into the broader literature on civil wars and violence against civilians is very promising. Ore has a couple of papers there, for example, and I think it really adds to this theoretical literature. So like Meg, I think you're onto something here. Especially because you also link it to the PKO angle, and to my knowledge, nothing of that sort has been done yet. But it would speak to a recent wave of literature trying to get more at this contextual aspects of PKOs and how they influence their performance and effectiveness. Now, having said that, I think it's not ready for prime time yet. So it would need another round of revision before you submit it for publication anywhere, and that's where I share Meg's view here. My main comment, and it is a bit of a big picture comment, is about the paper theoretical core, and in particular here, its theory of civil war and how it links to food aid, PKOs, and violence against civilians. When I read a paper that has, as a reader or reviewer, that has this angle on civilian victimization, I immediately look for the particular theoretical direction. I mean, normally you have either this popular support, territorial control argument, you have this rebel organization thing going on, or the bargaining model signaling. Here it took me some time to actually figure that out. And I think at the end, you go a bit to this bargaining model when you speak of signaling. But like Meg, for example, I was not quite sure about the grievance, food aid, and violence relationship here. So I think one of the main challenges here is to clearly explicate how these three factors are related to each other. And so, for example, early on, explain what kind of government-rebel interaction are we looking at here? Is it a bargaining model, or do civilians come in early on as the providers of support to either side? Is it more territorial control story? Is it about political organizations of the actors? I mean, if you keep this bargaining focus, also try to incorporate the other two approaches, because I think, I mean, you mentioned several times that you're trying to look at the causal mechanisms. I think there's a lot of stuff you could incorporate. So to what extent, for example, is violence against civilians as a signaling measure dependent on how food aid affects popular support, territorial control, or how do certain rebel groups, when there's significant differences in how they organize, how do they react to food aid given, and then how that affects in turn civilian victimization. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done fleshing this out. So far, I got sometimes a bit lost in what exactly the relationships are, the relationships of interest are here. Another bigger picture comment concerns empirical analysis, and I mean, I might commit the fault now that I talk a bit about the analysis I would like to see instead of rather what you have. But I think I thought about that. I think I have to say that because I think there's a missed opportunity here. So the analysis takes a country approach, if I'm not mistaken, and that is a bit, the view on what's happening is a bit too coarse due to that. So, and given that there's quite a lot of detailed data on there, geographical disaggregated, temporary disaggregated, you could dig really deep here into the causal mechanisms, as you say. So think, for example, about aid data, and I mean, I think if you look at the sector codes in aid data, you can tease out what is humanitarian aid and food aid. I think there's a paper by Reed Wood and Christopher Sullivan in JOP who looked at humanitarian aid that way. And then you would have the exact timing, the location of that kind of aid coming into a conflict zone. I mean, you already use ArcLID anyway, so you can spatially disaggregate violence against civilians. And the same, I mean, there's also data out there on PKO locations. I think just recently there was this data feature in JPR by Dennis Chill. I probably mispronounced that name. So I think it's called GeoPKO, the database, something like that. So you could have like really nice fine-grained data, and then you could have a go at really exploring how certain things work together, and result in, when food aid comes in, whether that results in more or less violence. I forgot a bit to look at the time, Cassie, so I don't know whether I talked a bit too much. But those are my two big comments actually about this paper.
Yeah, I think those are good high-level comments to start with. Or do you want to jump in with yours?
Yes. So thank you for the presentation. I'm going to agree with some of the comments that have already been brought up, but also I'm going to disagree with some of them, specifically with food security stuff. So let's start this way. I think the topic, the idea is really like the idea of the moderation, right? This is the story you want to tell, right? There is peacekeeping, right, has this moderated effect. That's cool, that's interesting. A moderated approach is a great way to create a new kind of argument that could be really much stronger, right? I think the story and the paper has to be framed around this. It's not right now. It's kind of nilly-nilly, it's unclear. It's kind of like you really want to be like, what's the moderator, what's the moderated variable, right? So in your case, it's saying like there's a relationship between food conflict. We expect the UN staff to kind of affect this. That's kind of a big issue. There's a literature. So the conflicted food stuff that has been heavily done, right? So like piles of research in recent year about food, definitely food security and conflict, food aid as well. I just reviewed, I mean, the last year I reviewed 2 of those papers for like econ journals, a bunch of political science, right? So you really want to think of like saying something new. The peacekeeping is interesting, right? That's what you're saying here. But you want to be very, very careful with how you frame this literature, especially because a lot of those claims are very, very broad, and recent studies have hammered. The all scarcity conflict stuff just doesn't hold. It's very, very contextual. In some cases, some not. Now, you're looking at violence against civilians. There is more support for the scarcity argument there, but still, the context now is what recent studies really have been hammering out. There's a new special issue on climate and conflict just came out of JPR. A lot of studies, right, recently, really the emphasis is on context, right? There is the Van Uxkul et al. At PNAS, right, that looks at droughts and ethnic grievances. So a lot of it is really in the context, and so that's something you need to look at, right? Because and then you want to move specifically to what pathway you hypothesize linking food aid to violence. Because again, there could be a scarcity pathway. It could be a looting logic, right? Those are opposite, right? What you kind of like saying here is that there is a scarcity pressure and food aid should mitigate this. Right, but again, the Wood and Sullivan paper or the QAnon would say, well, what you actually have is those looting mechanisms, where when you have more food aid, people, right, it's the Hendricks and Brinkman, there is a lot on that, right? So you want to think specifically of that particular pathway and really hammer it out and clearly and say, look, on average, right, understanding those kind of contextual themes and really talk about your regional analysis, you're focusing on those sub-Saharan African countries, explain why in this context, right, you would expect this relationship on average. It's also kind of nicer because if you do have, you know, it could actually, if you get the relationship that's opposite from what endogeneity might induce, that already helps you address some of the endogeneity concerns in advance, right? If you expect, for example, conflict to destroy food production, you have a positive relationship, it's probably not endogeneity. So again, if you can think of a way of maybe, you know, saying, look, if we get this expected sign, it's probably not endogeneity, it could help with that. So I would really say you want to kind of focus on the context, you want to tease out the specific pathway you kind of have in mind, right? You know, bringing some of the logic. Why should it be related to violence against strategy, right? Like, so is it because of just general violence, or is there a strategic logic to the violence, right? So if you say, look, we take the strategic perspective, Valentino, right? Then we expect this kind of looting mechanism to operate, therefore we'd expect a positive relationship. Or you could say, look, what we have in those contexts is actually other groups that they don't care. What they're trying to do is just harm the government, harm the civilians. So what happens with this food aid, it just creates those clusters of people that are just easy to target, right? It's like, what's that movie that starts with, I don't remember, but it might be Blood Diamond. One of those movies that start and they shoot everybody with the food aid, right? So you can, I think that's the argument Ottmann and Sullivan and Wood actually, right? That's exactly what happens, that they kind of pile up. So if you like tease that out, use the literature, frame the kind of link that you say, bring in a lot of food security research and explain why food aid is different than food security stuff. Because if you start delving into the whole environmental conflict and food security area, you are going into a major black hole that you might not want to go into because you're really talking specifically about food aid. And that's a particular type of lootable resource that's crucial, that people really need to survive. So it creates those clustering effects, kind of can argue with that. They say, well, what happens is that it's much harder to do that if you have a bunch of peacekeepers on the ground, right? And then you use the number of like, right, I mean, Megan would be much better at, you know, give you much better advice in terms of the data, right? But like having, you know, the presence of the number of UN, right? Because having a mission is not sufficient. Maybe you need to look at the number of individuals. And so this way you can, and kind of can think about those as a preventive mechanism. Maybe there are bargaining related issues, right? Like like third parties involved or things like that. So make that argument really, really flowing, because right now it's really kind of all over the place. There's a lot of stuff. You want it very, very clear, especially when you're telling an interactive story. It has to be very, very clearly made. So that's the kind of big session I have. I have a bunch of comments in addition to that, a bunch of stuff on the empirics, but we can talk about those later. I mean, I think the empirical, we have a lot to talk about the empirics as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Meg, you want to jump in on that thread?
A real quick follow-up, and thanks to the both of the other discussants for just, yeah, highlighting incredibly important things. So within the theory, when you go to focus on the interaction between the UN and food aid and violence, I think you're going to have to be very clear about, is it that the UN is affecting violence through kind of its normal mechanisms, and then therefore this makes food aid more effective, or that, but simply by the UN doing what it does that make food aid work better? Or is there something particularly unique about how the UN works in the presence of food aid? So, and I don't actually know the answer to that. I know that the UN, normally does things like serves as a barrier to violence. And so, it's possible that you see that effect heightened by the presence of food aid. Or it could be that the UN, takes on these certain unique, very effective mechanisms when food aid is present that ultimately reduces violence. And so this is where I think, really doing some reading on cases and, maybe some conversations with individuals at the UN about how peacekeepers act in the presence of food aid would be really helpful.
Do either of the authors want to talk a little bit? I think you've got some really good cohesive comments around the theory, and it might be useful to hear. What are you thinking in terms of trying to hone, your main theoretical expectation? And in particular, all the discussions touched on what's going on at the strategic level. Is this about territory? Is this about competition between groups? Is this about looting resources? What is it? What do you kind of want to clarify there? So I think that would be useful to hear a little bit more on.
Yeah, like can I go first then? For me, it's like I'm just like blown away with this like fantastic comments, because like yeah, like for example, like for the first comment from Megan is that like we had like a problem like for like last conferences, like it was in like SPSA, and I was the person who is like in charge of the theoretical part, and like Sam was like talking about like, dude, we're like talking about food aid. Why is the theory all about PKO, right? And I totally agree with Megan that like there's so many things like going on here. So and definitely but we were still like not sure about which path we can go, because like we have like less information about the like whole research field. And thank you, really, thank you so much for that. And also like the other comments, yeah, of course, like I mean, like, there's nothing I can like actually argue against about. So there are, yeah, we will like, we are trying to like planning to work on this paper during the summer. And of course, we totally agree that this paper is not at the stage where we can just like submit for a publication. There should be like so much work done in like actually like pushing out everything, and then like being more robust on our theoretical part and the actual empirical part also. So I just want to like yeah, like express my gratitude to all your great comments, and I thank you that like for letting us be here. And I'll pass the mic to Sam.
Thank you guys so much for all your comments. We started writing this paper more as pretty much we had read a lot about the relationship between food security and violence against civilians generally. And then we're thinking, okay, what could be the solution, right? What could break this relationship? And we're like, okay, food aid one, but we're providing food in itself, because it comes from the literature that argues that in times of war, scarcity of food increases, it becomes a resource on its own, and then we get more violent interactions between civilians who might be farmers or who want to keep their own food and not share with the rebels anymore, since it's now a price resource. And we felt, okay, if you provide more food, it reduces its value, maybe reducing interaction. But if we had peacekeepers, does that in any way create barriers? And then we started reading more and started expanding. I think we went a bit crazier with it. And thank you for pointing that out and kind of like bringing up the call to bring more parsimony to basically the explanation we're trying to put forward. And I'm grateful for that. We had earlier used the monthly data, which are like, of course, we want more observations, always like help with data analysis and stuff. But because our food aid data, which is a big part, is kind of yearly data from the WFP, were advised really that it was inappropriate for us to, or it wasn't the best practice for us to use that and have it like duplicated to fit monthly data in any way. And so we kind of like collapsed it. end product, we have, even if we're looking at a longer number of years, we had fewer cases to work with. And I don't understand the problems with that, right? In that you would expect there might be a lot of variation within a year, but we're open to looking into more data sets because we kind of like looked around to see what we could find and work with that. And I thank you for the suggestions on other people who have reached out on this. We're definitely going to look into that as well.
Yeah, let's have
yeah,
Ore jump in. I think he might have some comments on that.
Yeah, so I'm not really familiar as much with the data, but I'm not sure if you can get one of your main independent variables to be localized, then the other one could still be at the country level, right? That's not a problem. You know, I mean, you're gonna have to add fixed effects by country and things like that. But if you can have, say, UN deployment by location, I don't know if it exists, or food aid by, right? So the other one could actually still remain at the country level. That's another nice thing about the interaction, right? Because what happens if you're doing this in a way, you kind of, well, you're introducing a lot of autocorrelation to the data, but that makes it under most circumstances more likely that you're going to reject kind of the hypothesis rather than accept it, right? So, so I think you could make the case if you can even have, again, the violence. It's obviously you can get it as disaggregated, but if you can have one of the IVs as disaggregated, and again, I'm not sure what's out there in that regard, but you could kind of look around and see it. If it's out there, that would definitely, I think, add a lot to the empirics. You know, and again, we can talk more about the empirics if you want, but that would be one suggestion. Just if you could find something like this, then you can go, you know, even if one of them is still not true, you can still go inside the state.
Thank you so much. We will do that. Thank you.
And just to add to that, I think it was interesting in your response that it sounded like you did have a logic of how civilians respond to aid as your starting point. And I think that gets lost kind of throughout the paper. It gets sort of higher and higher level, but getting back to that local dynamic would be really interesting. And I don't think there is a lot going on at the interaction at that local level. So like Ore saying, depending on the data availability, maybe you can go back to that original thought that it seems like you had sort of motivating the paper. Additional comments maybe on the empirics, since we've talked about the theory for a while?
Ore, go ahead.
I mean, I think an issue that was also in the QA that you do want to think about is that heterogeneity, how you're going to tackle that. There are different ways of thinking about that and trying to address this. From, you know, econometric modeling solutions, again, if you have a group panel, down to, as I said, right, if you can hypothesize a sign that goes against the heterogeneity, that's already at least a way to preempt it. So that's why I'm suggesting to really think specifically about some of those dynamics could actually help you address some of those concerns theoretically. Beyond that, as I said, you know, I'm a big fan of like generalized methods of moments models, that if you have a good panel, you could use those in research robustness. Again, they're very, very sensitive to specification. So that's the kind of bigger issue introduced to those. But they can help you, again, at this show that say, look, you know, the results are actually more effective when we do that, and the models are not overspecified. There are a lot of other solutions by various probits and whatnot, selection models, but I would say, I think you really want to think a bit about that because that's something that constantly pops up with the food and conflict research, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, if you have a good theory, right, you can do a strategic model, something like this, that could really exploit some of those heterogeneities to capture those mechanisms, right? So it's not only a bad thing to have heterogeneity, but you really, really need to think how to deal with it, where it's coming from, right? You're looking, for example, at food aid within conflict areas. Well, that's already a major determinant of all the variables involved, right? It's kind of throwing things in the mess. So maybe there's a way to find food aid that's targeted to natural disasters, right? And try to see what happens if you just focus on that, right? So that gives you something a bit less affected by those issues. Like it's still going to be affected by conflict, right? Because transitioning food aid into a conflict area is just much harder. But while thinking of maybe some, like if you can identify specific types of food aid that are not conflict related, could also help you, at least thinking of some of the robustness approaches to this. Because in the end, you might say, look, we did whatever we can to show endogeneity is not driving the results. We just don't have a 100% test, you know. So whatever you can kind of throw in there to show robustness to some of those issues could, I think, go a long way in terms of doing that. And it's really theoretically driven.
Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
You You can go ahead, Meg. Martin can jump in. Right
Yeah, I think it was your turn anyway.
Well, I don't have a two finger, so I have a kind of some different issues. So go ahead, Martin.
Okay.
Yeah, just when Ore mentioned about from different types of food aid and things like that, I was thinking about the other thing where you could look at or disaggregate a little bit more would be, for example, simply look at the type of violence by perpetrator. I mean, that would be pretty standard and along the lines of that. There's often the case that government rebels have different incentives and or logics drive when they engage in violence against civilians. So I wouldn't be overly surprised if you have different findings just by looking at government violence against civilians or rebel violence against civilians. I mean, the other thing is that obviously, yeah, proxy violence might also be a big issue. I mean, ArcLID has data on I mean, if you look at ArcLID data, I think you find a lot of instances of violence against civilians by militias. And then if you would link that with recent literature on pro-government militias by Carey and Mitchell and others, you would find that government even often rely on this kind of actors. I mean, especially with food aid. I mean, what I often used to think about was the case of Sudan in the 90s, and then later on with Darfur and Khartoum heavily relied on militias. So they often let these militias do the dirty work. So that would be one way of having, disaggregating it further, not only by food aid, but also by the type of violence. Bigger picture here then would be, again, to also talk a bit about the scope conditions. So what kind of conflicts are we actually talking about here? I mean, I was just, so it's African and Asian cases in your sample, I think, if I'm not misremembering that right now. And then again, I mean, simple thing like, pardon?
It's just African cases.
Just African. Okay, then forget about this comment. Then I want to talk a bit about the difference between African and Asian, but still the same. I mean, I think not accounting for the different types of rebel organizations matters a lot then, and I think that's something where she should also go a bit deeper.
Just to add, from the audience a while ago, you had a question about endogeneity concerns between food aid and intensity. And this already came out when Ore was talking, but some of the comments you're getting to about even just better describing the data and the distribution of aid, the conflict type. I think some of these even descriptive components, being clearer about them in your data would help people think through what kind of endogeneity concerns might be driving the results. So I just wanted to add that, and then Meg, you can go ahead.
Thanks. I completely agree with Martin, and I was going to bring up as well the possible differences between the rebel use of violence and the government use of violence. I think one approach that might be worth replicating is the Wood and Sullivan paper. And basically, you know, they separate out violence used by the government, violence used by the rebels, find that humanitarian aid increases the use of rebel violence against civilians, but doesn't have an effect on the government. And then at the end of that paper, they interact the distribution of aid with the number of peacekeepers. They use OECD aid measures, I believe, and are able to use the codes in those data to exclude food aid. So you could take their approach, but include food aid and exclude the other types of aid. However, I believe Wood and Sullivan are using UCDP data for their dependent variable. And I was curious as to why you use ACLID data, and particularly the number of attacks rather than the intensity of, I'm not familiar with ACLID data very well, so I'm not sure what's available, but the number of attacks, it reflects something, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the intensity of violence used against civilians. And you might find something different depending on how many civilians are killed versus how many attacks occur on civilians. So just, that's something that you might have to think about in the the process is perhaps presenting, you know, both types of measures of violence.
Yeah, do y'all want to respond to that at all? Like the choice of ACLA data, that might be helpful to hear a little bit more on. And then, you know, using number of attacks versus the fatality of the attacks. I think that's like a.
So I think what we did kind of like links more with, I think other people have used that data set look at it is in terms of terror, in times of use of terrorism, in times of civil war. And so by using the number of attacks, we kind of, the ACLED data set also has a number of people who die in those attacks. So that's something we could easily do, but it's more about intentional violent interactions between non-state actors and civilians. So that we use that measure because we felt it captures a change relationship more than actual just number of deaths in terms of the number of people who have died during this during a civil war, because this kind of like creates a level of what I say is it's not collateral damage or anything of that nature anymore. It is intentionally attacking civilians. The good part about it, however, is it's not, some of these interactions don't have not as many people die sometimes. So it still counts as one violent interaction. It might mean the burning down of houses or attacking on the farm and stuff like that. And we're just saying moving from what would have been peacetime interaction between non-state actors and civilians as their target as opposed to government. And what we find where in times of war, where for whatever reason that changes, where it's turning on civilians intentionally, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, Mark.
And so I'm not sure if it might help. We could use the ACLED because it does have the count, I think, of the number of deaths. So I think it measures for police violence against civilians, attacks on civilians by the police, attacks on civilians by militia groups, and attacks on civilians by rebel groups. And so we just use the non-state actors, militia, rebel, and to create this variable of armed groups attacking civilians. But if it helps, we've considered using the count of those who were killed in such attacks yearly as another factor.
I just wanted, I really like the point Meg just made about ACLED. I mean, it's been a while that I looked at the data, but I mean, there are two things which might be worth investigating a bit. I mean, I don't know how the coverage looks like right now or by now, but at least a few years ago, it was a bit erratic which countries they coded and the years they coded for each country. I don't know whether they now have full coverage for Africa. Maybe they do, but that might be an issue where you get yourself, when particular cases are excluded, then the sample is a bit affected. The other thing I would probably have another look at is how they define an event. Because, I mean, as a matter of fact, I mean, you count the number of instances of civil victimization. Again, I'm not entirely sure right now, but I think UCP, GED, and ACLED have different ways of how they define an event. And if you look at that, it's always, there might be different implications coming from that. So, I mean, not that fatality numbers are better. I mean, there are also a lot of question marks about that, of fatality counts, but I think with the event data, I would probably be a bit more cautious with the number of events they capture, because first of all, it's a matter of how it's reported in newswires, and then it's also a matter of how they define an event and whether you reflect their particular definition for an event and whether there's any implications for your dependent variable.
I think Ore had a two-finger on that.
Yeah, so a couple of notes I echo because I do use it a lot, and it is, I think, considered in many ways the ground truth nowadays, as close as you can get to it in terms of cross-national. I mean, it's in that the Economist uses it, right? So obviously it's but they do but Mani's point is correct, right? So like you get coverage for most countries nowadays. I think they cover about 125, 127, but that's only really recently. If you're doing sub-Saharan Africa, that really goes back to 97 when they start with, right? So you're okay, but there's still going to be some biases with coverage. So you need to kind of control for some temporality. You want to probably include fixed effects in this. I'm going to add a couple of actually comments on the modeling. First of all, beyond the deny stuff, and assuming you are going to keep the negative binomial regression, which you might also already face, some people are already moving to the OLS and fixed effects world, but it's your choice if you want to keep that. But a couple of things, those models are really sensitive to independent variables with large spectrums, right? So you see those coefficients when you have dot and 7 zeros and then coefficient. So if you log those things, which is what usually people do, you might get very different results. And part of the reason is because those outliers, those models are really sensitive to this, right? Especially negative binomials, they're finicky. If you start adding fixed effects, they don't really, right? There's a paper that actually shows that they're actually biased if you add country fixed effects. But in any case, when you start adding those kind of stuff, like those models kind of can run amok, they run into convergence problem. So first of all, I would say try to log those variables. You might actually get results. You're saying you don't get, my hunch would be that you will if you log them. That's one thing. The other thing is, I'm actually not a big fan of controls and observational data, but one thing that was striking me is where's the population stuff, right? So you look into those countries, obviously there's going to be more food aid going to countries with more people. Well, not obviously, presumably, right? There's going to be some relationship. Well, you want to kind of think of how to address that, right? If you're not doing country fixed effects, which I think you should because you are looking at within country attacks, but let's say, okay, there might be a possibility there is across the borders, things like that. But you still want to, you have multiple years over time, you want to cluster some way, account for some heterogeneities, right? You have country-specific heterogeneities that happen over time. You want to kind of account for that as well. And then another thing, so because you're doing the interactions, as I said, interactions can be really, really strong tool, but you need to treat them very, very carefully and effectively. Right? There's the Bramber et al. 2006 paper from quick analysis. It's a great kind of explanation of how to. So you want to include the components, explain like, right, what each component means at the absence of the interaction, right? So like the interaction means what? So here's the basic coefficient for this, the absence of the other. And then there are packages that, I don't know if they're going to do it for negative binomial, honestly, but think about, you can do it manually. You can actually take out the predicted probabilities, try to plot the effect. Because the interaction, you can't really interpret it just by significance. It doesn't work this way, right? There's substantive stuff, and that's even if it's OLS, right? In order to understand how interaction works within your data, considering that those, the coefficients really represent a zero case and the other, so you might not have a zero case, right? I mean, in your case, you probably have zeros on both food aid and UN, so it's not gonna necessarily matter as much, but still, visualization is much, much nicer way of doing things. Definitely, if your data doesn't have zero cases in one of the variables, then the baseline coefficients just give you the kind of estimates for zero case that doesn't exist in your data. So you want to visualize this, right? You want to show the effect. And so even if you don't see a statistically significant result, well, there might still be something interesting going on with the substantive, right? You can't really ascertain the effects without substantive interpretation. I guess that's the key thing. So you want to explain both what each component says, what is like, so a constituent coefficient, and interpret the interaction visually. And I think that could really help, even if you don't have statistical significance.
Those are really good comments. And all of you have offered a great discussion today. Hopefully our presenters agree, but we have about 3 minutes left. Are there any burning final comments our discussants want to say? You can just kind of wave at me and I'll stop talking. Your waving time is almost up, which means that we'll just ask for some closing comments from our presenters and then we'll wrap up. But I just want to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here today to discuss this work. I think it was really productive.
Then I'll go first. I mean, like, I'm so even like honored because of this like great comments from like great people group. Like, so Sam and I are like just good friends, and we wanted to do something like while hanging out, and then that leads to like here. And I'm so glad that we got this opportunity, and we will try our best to improve among like those many great comments. And thank you once again.
I also want to say thank you to everybody, and thanks for your kind and constructive comments about different ways. Many of the issues we had questions about, you reaffirming them kind of like helps us to work on this paper more, and then opening us up to even more things we can do and more ways we can make our work clearer. We're just really grateful. We are really grateful, and we're definitely going to put all these things you've told us into our work going forward. It's something we plan to work on more during the summer, and I'm just grateful that you're taking your time to like give us all these ideas and talk to us about all these things, paying particular attention to many of the triumphs and shortcomings of the paper, and helping us, with guardrails on how to work with it going forward. So thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for presenting. All of this will be put up online. Find us on Twitter, tell your friends, and we'll see you soon, hopefully at one of these or Peace Science. Y'all have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.